Hello and welcome everyone to this panel for the Charleston Conference 2025. The panel title is Research Impact and the Role of the Academic Librarian. My name is Terry Talene and I'm president of the Americas region for Emerald Publishing. And I'm really pleased to be here, honored really to have this conversation with some of the people who are really working on the front lines of this question. This conversation follows an event that took place last year at Charleston that was very well attended and generated a lot of follow-up. And so I'm really pleased to be able to kind of bring this different panel of experts together today. The premise of the conversation is really that, of course, the point of research is to make an impact in some way. And impact in the literature is important, impact in the media, impact in social media, is valuable. But these things don't really tell us the whole story of a piece of research. And in fact, they don't really speak to the reasons that people often are doing the research that they're doing. So really happy to be part of this conversation, and I would really like to thank our panelists. And I'm going to turn off our slide now so that you can see them properly. And so thank you so much to Willa Liebert-Tavernier, Research Impact and Open Scholarship Librarian at Indiana University in Bloomington, Susan Reno, Assistant Professor of Strategic Communication and Associate Vice Chancellor for Research Development and Strategic Partnerships at the University of Missouri. Susan is also Executive Director of the Center for Advancing Research Impact in Society, or ARIS. And finally, last but not least, David Phipps, Assistant Vice President of Research Strategy and Impact at York University and Director of Research Impact Canada. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'd like to turn it over to you now, really, because you can do a better job of explaining your own interest and your own backgrounds better than I can. So I'd like to ask Willa first, just to talk about your professional background, your current role at IU, how you came to be interested in the topic of research impact, and any projects that you're working on, anything that you would like people to know as we get started.
Sure. My current role is as the Research Impact and Open Scholarship Librarian at Indiana University, Bloomington. My path to this work is somewhat unusual. Librarianship is a second career for me. At the time I got interested in impact, I was an open scholarship librarian in a visiting position in the scholarly communication department at Herman Wells Library. I started out assisting our scholarly communication librarian with bibliometric queries. At the same time, Heather Coates at our sister campus in Indianapolis was doing a lot of work on the responsible use of metrics, and I thought that work was very valuable. So I started putting together a programmatic offering through the library's scholarly communication department. So seminars, library guides, and consultations around the concept of taking charge of your scholarly narrative, helping scholars to tell their own impact story and assisting them with the responsible use of metrics in service of their narratives. Before long, I received a request from an emerita faculty member to help her track citations of her dissertation, which had over decades become seminal in her field of recreation studies. She was very surprised by the reach of her work, especially the geographic reach that we found. She hadn't thought of it in those terms. She had just been trying to count citations and reached out for help because she suspected that there were more out there than she had been able to find. That was my first big research impact project, and the results really showed how librarians add value to the research enterprise. Faculty are doing research to advance knowledge in their field and in turn make useful advances in society. And we were really able to show how her work did that.
Great, thank you so much. It's really so interesting to hear how people come to this work. Susan, would you mind going next?
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm Susan Reno, and I've been interested in research impact my entire professional life. Currently, I serve as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Missouri, and part of my portfolio includes public engagement. My position is a joint report between the Research Office and the Office of Extension and Engagement, and this connection allows for bidirectional communication between research happening on campus and with communities. I'm also an assistant professor of strategic communication in the Missouri School of Journalism, and my research group looks at the role of research impact in institutional marketing and branding. So we do this also in my research group. Lastly, I have the pleasure of serving as the executive director of the Center for Advancing Research Impact in Society, and ARIS provides professional development and resources for individuals and institutions to grow their capacity for societal impact. So I've been involved in impact in all areas of my professional life.
Great. We're so happy to have you here today. Thank you so much. David, over to you.
Yeah, my name is David. My pronouns are he and him, and I was born to white parents in England and moved to these lands that some people call Canada when I was 2 years old. I live in Toronto with my husband, and that's on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the current treaty holders of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I am grateful to acknowledge the First Peoples of Charleston, the Etiwan, the Kiowa, the Edisto Natchezcuso, the Santi, and the Wasimasa. I am the Assistant Vice President for Research Strategy and Impact at York University, and I am the Network Director for Research Impact Canada. That's a network of 41 organizations that are building institutional capacity for knowledge mobilization and to enable the broader impacts on broader society. And we'll be talking a lot about that in this seminar.
Yep. Great. Thanks so much. Since we have you, David, since I have you, I think I'll start this first question by asking you to speak first. So my first question to all of you is, how do you define impact in your current role? How do your institutions define impact? And have these definitions changed over time? Are they changing? Kind of just to do a sort of status check on where we are right now with the real impact conversation.
Sure. I'm happy to start. I use the definition of impact from Julie Bailey, who's at London Northeastern University in the UK. And she says that impact is the provable effects, hopefully beneficial, of research in the real world, or real world meaning beyond scholarship. So I think there's a lot in there. It's got to be, we hope they're beneficial effects, but we can talk about that they're not always, but they have to be provable. We've got to be able to demonstrate the evidence of the impact on broader society. And I do think that impact is on broader society, impact on scholarship, on metrics of citations and bibliometrics. They're important, but that's not the only type of impact that we're talking about.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'm curious to know, so David, you're based in Canada, and obviously Susan and Willa are based in the US. Susan, I'm wondering if you could speak to the kind of the US context, because I think that, I know there's no shared framework here or in the US for excellence in research, or for what defines good across institutions and around the country. So I'm wondering if you would mind speaking to the US context here, how you define impact in your current role.
I'll just piggyback on what David said. Absolutely, defining impact as the provable, changes that happen outside of the academy. One of the things I love is it's the changes we can see beyond the academy that happen because of the research, and how we connect academic research to changes in the real world. And I'll just say that for many years, impact has been defined by what could be measured: attendance, participation, citations, patents, because that's easy. We can count something. We're seeing now a change to looking at things that are harder to measure but equally important. How are people's lives better because of the research? It really gets at that definition of impact. The thing about that is that measuring impact takes time, it takes resources, and it takes intentionality. And institutions are being very thoughtful now about how to assess and communicate impact. One of the things that I think we've seen a big change in is that now we're looking at societal impact through things like economic indicators, employment, how many small business startups have happened, or health indicators like patients served in clinical trials. Institutions are also building infrastructure to support researchers in designing research with impact in mind. An example is the ARIS Center runs a program called ORIC, the Program to Enhance Organizational Impact Capacity. And we've had almost 40 institutions come through the program since its inception, and we anticipate that's only going to keep growing. Another example of this is the way that promotion and tenure is changing across the academy. More and more institutions are expanding what counts as research excellence to include the scholarship of engagement, as well as promotion, as well as entrepreneurship and innovation. So those are some things that I see changes in the way we think about what counts as excellence, is really looking at the infrastructure that's being built, as well as the changes in promotion and tenure.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, before I ask Willa to jump in, I say I worked for many years, for 25 years at one of the big three publishers. And so citations and counting citations and, looking for citations and measuring them was kind of the way I grew up really in publishing from the publisher perspective. So it's been so interesting and just eye-opening for me to be working now with people who are really thinking about how you can measure, but I can also see how difficult it really is. And I'm really happy to have a librarian here to talk about this, because I imagine, Willa, you're kind of right in the intersection of, right with the institution and the researcher and the broader society, or the broader community in which the institution is located. Would you mind just speaking to that? How do you define impact now in your current role, and do you see that changing at all, even if it's slowly?
Yes. So at IU Bloomington, we don't yet have a shared definition of impact, but there's definitely a growing interest from campus leadership in helping scholars demonstrate the impact of the work, with a particular interest in community engagement. Being in Indiana, this is a state that still has a lot of rural communities. So we're very big on rural engagement. We have a Center for Rural Engagement, but the work is now making its way up the value chain in the campus community, so that administrators are paying attention to this more in the context of evaluation. And it's good to see this reflected in other institutions as well, because the metrics, even though they've been a central focus of conversation for such a long time, they can provide this sense of false objectivity. Susan measured something we can count. So because we can count it, it oftentimes makes people think this is neutral and this is unbiased, which metrics are not. They can actually hide bias. And then because at IU Bloomington, we're historically an arts and humanities campus, the way a lot of our faculty work looks very different from a campus like, say, our Indianapolis campus, where the medical school is. So an increased focus on public engagement and what change happens in communities because of your work is very welcome. In my role, I try not to define impact, but center the scholars' work. And when faculty ask for a consultation, I have them complete a scholarly visibility and impact check, which is essentially a quadric survey that's asking them what is important to you. And then I look at that through multiple ways of how they could demonstrate impact. So I really am not relying solely on citation counts or age indexes or impact factors of the journals they publish in. I'm looking at a multiplicity of factors when talking about impact.
Okay, thank you. And since this conversation is really, with a lot of librarians, given the Charleston context, I'm wondering, Willa, it sounds like you have support in your organization, and you've been broadening the definition when in your work. What role do you think librarians more generally can play in helping researchers and even institutions think about the way they measure impact? Is there a way that people can work together, or is there some kind of guidance that you might be able to offer to librarians who are interested in starting to kind of push for change in the way we define impact?
Yes, so because librarians sit at the heart of the research enterprise, because we're identifying, sourcing, curating research, this positions us uniquely to advocate for change and to do a lot of outreach. So I see a lot of role here, a lot of potential here for educating ourselves and educating the wider community, campus community. Since administrators are now paying more attention, we can use that to do outreach about the alternative frameworks for evaluation that exist. And there are quite a few now that people have been thinking about this for over a decade. A lot of people will be familiar with the DORA movement. The Leiden Manifesto is another one. There's a conference called International Forum on Expert Finder Systems, but they do a lot of they showcase a lot of work around research impact. There's the scope framework, which is more sort of the process. How do you go about it? And there's also a Humetrics framework for the humanities. There's a Becker model in the sciences. All of these are frameworks that say, let's take a wider look and let's take an approach that emphasizes multiplicity, because different fields have their disciplinary differences, and you have to take that into account. And on a more concrete level, when I produce research impact reports, I try to really take a values-driven approach, looking at the values of the field. So for a poet, for example, yes, this poet also writes articles. So yes, I'm looking at citation counts of their work, but I also acknowledge the temporal realities of the humanities, in that there's a great longitudinal study that was done by Cassidy Sugimoto, Vincent Lariviere, and Blaise Cronin, where they're showing that over 50% of humanities work gets the first citation after the 10-year mark. So with a 10-year clock, that's 6 years, we have a temporal mismatch, right? So we have to look at other things, and we also have to quantify this so that when it goes all the way up to administration, we have to write that in so that they're not comparing your work with the work of somebody in another field and coming to the conclusion that you're underperforming. So I also look at the database WorldCat to show library holdings of her work and what's the geographic reach of these holdings, reach out to media outlets that had interviewed her and featured her work to get what are your distribution numbers, what are your subscription numbers, document attendee counts from performances. So even though some of this is still counting, it's looking at a wider range of things. And then there's also the narrative examples that talk about the publication choices in her field, why it's important, for example, to maybe publish in things that are publicly accessible. Looking at the editorial board makeup, a lot of the places this poet publishes, then it's not going to have impact factors. A lot of the times it's trade magazines. So we have to look at different things and imagine multiple ways of demonstrating value and impact than trying to force the work into a metrics first framework, which can be reductive.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And that's actually a wonderful, I think, segue to our final question. And I think I'm going to ask David maybe to speak on this one first about really what can other rights holders, including publishers, do to support this kind of change? We've talked about the role of librarians, but there are, of course, a lot of other parties involved in these conversations. Just wondering if you have being someone who's very involved in this work, as is Susan. What can other right holders do in this space?
Sure. Well, I'm going to talk first about some of the funders, what they have done in Canada, but I know the US has got different types of funders than just what we have in Canada. So Susan might be able to elaborate there. But then I do want to talk about publishers. In Canada, we have three main federal funders: the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. They have all recently signed the DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment. They've signed on to DORA, and when you sign on to DORA, you're not just signing your name, you're committing to making change. And DORA is looking at how do we how do we make changes on research and researcher assessment? And so the Tri-Councils have introduced a new narrative CV, which is very different for Canada, and it's being rolled in over the next couple of years of applications. And in the narratives, it's not just what have you done, but what difference has that made? And there's all sorts of, whether it's from, and I love, Willa, that you talked about community engagement. So there's community engagement, decolonization, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, the contributions to commercialization, to entrepreneurship, to research data management, and contributions to scholarship as well. So it's really, many of us in Canada and Research Impact Canada in specifically, we've got a working group on this, is how do we help our researchers go from lists of stuff that they've done to choose those things and tell us how they've made a difference, and how do we know what's the impact of that. So I think the funders have a major role in catalyzing our thinking about impacts. And publishers, I'll just talk about the Emerald Publishing has the Real World Manifesto, which is a manifesto of how Emerald as a publisher recognizes that citations, bibliometrics, as important as they are not enough to describe the impacts of research. And so I've done a little bit of work with Emerald on some of the impact tools that Julie Bailey from London Northeastern and I have developed, and have published with Emerald. And and Emerald was one of the first publishers I saw that had a completely open peer review process. And I think that's really, it's not for all journals for sure, but it's really important that I think as we are thinking about open access, open science, that we think of open peer review as well. So I think the funders and the publishers, and beyond that, other rights holders like community organizations, right, are really the end beneficiaries of the work that we're looking to do. So I don't know, Susan, any thoughts on, because you've got different types of funders in the States that we have in Canada?
Absolutely. So one of the things I want to highlight is the role of private foundations. Our private foundations have had a really important role in moving forward societal impact. They host convenings on impact. They have many programs that support that work. And then they have working groups too. So we've been seeing an uptick, not just in them asking their researchers that they're funding to think about the impact of their work, but also having these kind of conversations. Because having publishers convene conversations like this, having private foundations convene these kinds of meetings, industry partners having these kind of meetings, academic as well as governmental groups doing that, all of that elevates the conversation about impact in a way that we haven't seen in recent years. I like to tell people that I feel like all the sectors are coming together because we realize that research is really important in communities, but also having that bi-directional and co-created conversation around what counts as research and what communities need is really important. And so we've seen a lot of different rights holders come together to really move this conversation forward.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We're obviously, we're recording this for replay in at the virtual version of the Charleston event, and there will be an opportunity for question and answer there live. So I think, I will leave the additional the questions that are popping to my mind. I think I'll leave them because I'm sure that others will be wondering the same things. I'd just like to thank you all so much for this. I really, really appreciate your perspectives. And it's really, as someone, as I said, who's worked in publishing for a long time, it's really, it's been very eye-opening for me to be involved in these conversations, and it's it feels about time. So I'm really, really grateful to you for the work that you're doing, and really, really grateful that you were willing to participate in this conversation today. And I hope that the attendees at Charleston find it as interesting and valuable as I did. Thank you so much, and I'll look forward to the Q&A.